Today, Future Medicine AI is joined by Dr. Hugh Harvey, a radiologist turned AI and regulatory expert who's been at the forefront of bringing AI into healthcare. So Hugh, thank you very much for joining us. And I was wondering if you could get started by telling us a bit about what you're doing at the moment and your journey to where you are.
Well, thanks for having me. So I'm Hugh. I run a business called Hardian Health, which helps companies, academics, and investors try and get health tech actually to market. There's a lot of excitement around health tech. Everyone is making apps or thinking about AI, and there's huge potential for what this stuff can do. But what we do is help people get that stuff to market through several functions. The first one is clinical evidence. So for any piece of software that is trying to do something impactful in a clinical pathway, quite rightly, you need to show that it works and it works safely. So we help people generate that evidence. We help people go through the regulations around software, especially AI software. We help people demonstrate return on investment. So we do health economic modeling. So we make sure by measuring cost utilities and cost functions and building health economic models, we can show that a technology will have a positive financial impact on a healthcare system. We also do a bit of intellectual property strategy, so helping people trademark and patent and things like that. And we do some market access strategy as well. So lots of interviewing of stakeholders, typically within the NHS, and trying to figure out what the procurement routes are and help our clients develop a strategy to get into hospitals. I think all of that is super important, and I kind of think of it like a bit of a jigsaw puzzle that a startup has to figure out all the bits to put in place, and we're sort of a helping hand. And what we're best known for, I think, is the regulatory function, and it's certainly the most sort of in-demand part of what we do. And that's the technical diligence of demonstrating to an independent body that your device does what it says and is safe, and that you've taken a commitment to quality. So it's exciting times, and happy to unpack more of that in this interview.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. And so it's obviously a massive challenge, positioning yourself and demonstrating that you have the approval and status to be able to deploy an AI device. So for people who aren't aware, could you talk a bit about what is involved in an AI medical device and why it is so challenging to deploy one into the healthcare?
Yeah, so it's not challenging. It's extremely logical. It's just work that often you don't know you need to do because you're not aware of medical device regulation. And I was the same. When I started out my career in health tech, I was working at a tech startup, and I didn't know we were building a medical device until the regulators came and told us we were. And so I don't blame people for being naive about knowing the regulations. It's like if you wanted to start a company making kettles, you're not aware of what the regulations are around electrical appliances, but you might think, I could go look them up or hire someone who does. And so I don't begrudge people who don't know this. And I like to try and sort of educate and preach about what the regulations are, who they're for, and how they work. So in order to answer the question about what are the regulations around AI as a medical device, the first thing to understand is what is a medical device. Because as soon as you say the words medical device to someone who's not aware, they might kind of think, I'm thinking of a scalpel or something. But in essence, a medical device is anything used for a clinical purpose. And this is kind of what the wording of the regulations start with. They say, a medical device shall be considered any instrument, apparatus, piece of equipment, software, anything that is intended by the manufacturer, so the person who's making that product, to be used for the benefit of an individual patient for any of the following purposes. And it lists a bunch of purposes after that. Diagnosis. It's clearly a clinical thing, isn't it? Preventing a disease, mitigating a disease, providing therapy for a disease. All of these things are clinical things that you'd expect a healthcare system to do. And so that's, in a nutshell, really the simple explanation of what a medical device is. And medical devices can be anything in a hospital or a GP clinic, or indeed now as a wearable that does something clinical. So from the watch I'm wearing, there's a regulated piece of software in that, which is a medical device that can check for atrial fibrillation, right? That's regulatory approved, clinical grade technology. It can be as very simple as a contact lens, a little bit of plastic that you put on your eye, but because it's interacting with the human body, there are rules around the materials and all this kind of stuff. Or it could be software that you deploy into a hospital that is going through electronic records and digging out information. So it can be anything, but as long as it's intended for a clinical purpose, it's very likely to be a medical device. So that's kind of the basic of it. And I spend most of my time explaining this to people. So I hope I'm making it sort of relatively clear and not scary. And as a patient, you'd want to know that everything that your doctor or your nurse is using on you is quality assured in some regard. And what I mean by that is, you wouldn't get into a car unless it had been through all the right processes to show that it's safe. You wouldn't sign on to a bank unless it had the assurance that your money is safe and secure. And so it's exactly the same thing in medicine, is that you're not going to use a drug or a medical device unless you know it's safe. And really, what in sort of consumer society, we don't check what safety stuff has happened. We just assume it's happened, right? So you don't know what safety testing your car has had, but you kind of know that they must have done the safety testing in order to be able to sell it to you. And there's exactly the same thing with medical device regulation. The problem is you have a situation where anyone can now build a software-based medical device. One person at home on their laptop can build an app and put it on the App Store. And so anyone using that piece of software, they have that typical consumer mentality where they go, oh, it's on the App Store, someone must have done the safety testing. But they haven't, because the person who made it didn't know they were building a medical device. And so this is kind of the struggle that I see people go through again and again and again on both sides. And quite rightly, when the NHS is looking to procure or purchase any of this new technology, they want to check that you have done all the right things and you've got all the right documentation, you've got the certifications. And they do check. So the regulations are not just for you to be able to sell it, it's actually for your customers to assure them that they are buying something that is, clinical grade and assured. So I hope that all makes logical sense. Like, it doesn't seem like stupid that these rules exist.
I think that's a really good overview. Like, it genuinely paints a good picture of the scene, I think, for people who might not understand it. And there's a few really good points that we can sort of pick off from there. I mean, one is the way that you said people are making a medical device and they're not actually realizing that they're making a medical device. And that obviously resonates with your background as well. So perhaps we could delve into that a little bit, because your background is actually in radiology. So could you tell me a bit about your journey from training as a radiologist to now a leader in AI regulation for healthcare?
Sure. So I trained as a doctor, and all doctors subspecialise into something. So I specialised into radiology. I was always like a computer geek at heart, and radiologists are the only doctors who sit in front of a computer all day. So I thought, well, let's go and do that. And, you don't have to deal with body fluids and things like that necessarily. So that's what attracted me to radiology. I did all the training and got to a consultant level. And then you have a choice. You can either go work as a consultant or you can go into academia. So I chose to go into academia. And I went to the Institute of Cancer Research for 2 years and did a research thesis. And at that time, I chose to study a bit on machine learning. So there were new deep learning architectures for segmenting images. And I'd seen people, segmenting cats out of photos. But obviously, as a radiologist, I was like, well, my job is essentially to look at images. And in my brain, I'm segmenting out what's going on the medical scan. So I thought, well, let's do some research. Can we apply it to scans? So I did that for 2 years, and we had some good results. And then I kind of thought that this AI thing had legs, and I wanted to do something outside of clinical practice, but I knew that in academia things moved very slow and it's hard to get funding, etc. And I saw that there was a company hiring clinicians to be in this AI startup. It was called Babylon, and I applied. Didn't get in straight away. I had to sort of keep knocking on the door, but eventually I got in and joined. Initially, I joined as one of the clinical team who were helping to do clinical safety around what they had at the time was a chatbot. And yeah, it was exciting times. It was very different from the NHS and academia. And how I fell into regulation of AI products was Babylon had made that mistake that I spoke about just before of not realizing that they were building a medical device. None of us knew what a medical device was. We knew that it should obviously have some assurance, which is why we were there as doctors to do the safety testing. We were just kind of almost making up what the safety test should be as we went along. And we were trying to use, our best practice and our knowledge and our experience to actually do the testing properly. But we didn't know there was this whole world of rules and things that you could actually leverage and use. So the UK regulators, so that's the MHRA, that's the Medicines and Health Regulatory Authority. I think that's the correct acronym, but the MHRA for short. They contacted Babylon and said, "Did you know you're building a medical device?" No, we didn't know. But in essence, I got picked out of the team of doctors. I can't remember if I volunteered or got picked. I think I got picked just to go and meet with the MHRA, so I had the meeting. And they explained to me what I explained to you, like, this is a medical device, this is what you need to do, there's rules and regulations. Can you become compliant? They didn't say, stop doing what you're doing. They're not the Gestapo. They want you to show to them that you're doing it in a compliant manner. So I had a sort of 6 months sort of self-taught baptism of fire into the medical device regulations, and I just read all of the regulations. You can download them on the internet for free, publicly available. I read them, and then I drew up a plan, and I went to the senior team and said, right, I need to do this, that, and then we sign this thing, and then we can get regulatory approval. And they were like, good, that's your job now. So that's how I landed in the regulatory space. So I did all the things the regulations said we should do, and I had discussions with the MHRA, and they were happy. And we registered the chatbot as a triage system, what's known as a Class 1 medical device. So there are different classes of risk for medical devices. Class 1 is the lowest risk. And the regulations at the time allowed you to self-certify as a Class 1 device. So, yeah, we signed our declaration of conformity, we registered with the MHRA, and we put what's known as the CE mark, the conformity stamp, on the product. And that was the first AI chatbot ever with a regulatory authorization. So I didn't realize it at the time, but that was like the start of what I was going to end up doing for the rest of my life. And then since then, I've lost count, hundreds of companies do the same. But I need to add that the regulations have shifted over time. You can't just self-certify an AI chatbot anymore, unfortunately, because the Class 1 loophole, as it's known, has been closed. And so there's more to do. So most software as a medical device, especially AI software, is higher risk. So it ends up in Class 2, which is the middle category of risk. And for that, you can't self-certify your device. What you have to do is draw up all your documentation, as you would, but then you have to be audited by a professional body, known in the UK as an approved body, or in Europe they call them notified bodies. And these are businesses like the British Standards Organisation who audit countless types of industries. They audit the automotive industry, the aviation industry, everything, and the medical device industry. And so you pay them a fee, and they come in, men in suits, into your office, and they say, right, show us all your documentation, show us your quality management processes, show us your clinical safety, and then they interview members of your team and check that people are, aware of all the quality processes that are going on and things like that. And then that takes 3 to 5 days, and then they give you a certificate. And then you're allowed to sell your device on market. So we help people prepare all that documentation, and we train them how to undergo audit. It's a bit like being a driving instructor. Right?
Yeah.
You can't learn to drive just by reading the highway code. You have to physically sit in your car and practice. And nobody really does that without someone else in the car, a driving instructor. So we are kind of like driving instructors for people trying to get through the medical device regulation. So you have homework to do. You have to read the regulation. We can't read it for you, but we'll tell you which bits to read and what bits are important. And then we can help you learn to drive your car, i.e. learn to drive the quality aspects of your business, because the auditors want to see you doing that, not some consultant like us.
And what are some of the challenges that come with helping businesses who are looking to get into this space to actually get into it? Because before they enroll their devices or get them to patients or to users, they first have to go through this regulatory process, which is obviously massive amount of resources and funding and whatnot. So they have to reach quite a substantial stage before they can actually see how their product works on the ground. So yeah, what are some of the challenges that you see with companies that are going through that?
Yeah, I see a lot that, and I like the term of phrase, regulatory grief. So in normal grief, there are 5 stages of grief. When someone dies, you go through 5 kind of well understood psychological phases, and I see the same thing with regulatory grief. So the first stage of regulatory grief is denial. So I see a proportion of people in denial that the medical device regulations exist, or they might be aware that they exist, but they're in denial that they apply to them and their product. And there's not much you can do to help people who are in denial. They will eventually realise, because their customers will ask them, where's your regulatory clearance? So that they're going to have to do it. So people in denial, very difficult to help because they don't want to be helped. They're either not aware or they actively don't believe the regulations are important for them. The second stage is anger. And so we get people angry that they have to do this stuff. And that anger can come from 2 main sources. One is they will have received a letter from the regulators saying, by the way, did you know you're building a medical device? Can you be compliant? Like Babylon did. And one of the first reactions, perfectly natural, is to be sort of angry, because it kind of immediately jars you and wakes you up out of your dream of building this thing. And then someone else has come in and put their oar in and said, no, you need to do it properly. So that can spark anger. And the other place the anger can come from is just from having your denial confronted, basically. You've been in denial, and when someone finally breaks through to you and you realise that you were wrong,
yeah,
that incites anger. So we have to sometimes calm clients down. And, we try and be the good guys in this situation, say, look, it's okay, we can help you get through it, blah, blah, blah. The third stage of regulatory grief is bargaining. So the natural instinct is to say, okay, fine, there's this stuff I need to do. What's the quickest, cheapest, and simplest way for me to do it? How can I get my way out of this situation? And so we often get emails from people saying, we're getting quotes from several regulatory consultants, and we're going to go with the cheapest one. And I think you already know what I'm going to say after that. Cheap is not always necessarily the best, especially when it comes to producing clinical grade quality assurance.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of people selling automated compliance checkers, and a lot of people selling blank templates for people to fill in. But we believe, going back to the driving instructor kind of analogy, you have to sit in the car with the client and actually actively teach them. That's the only really sensible way to get it through to their head. You can give them all the tools are useful, but they're not going to learn to drive the car just by using some automated tools. They actually had to physically do it and feel the movement of the vehicle, as it were. So, yeah, they bargain, and they try and do it as fast as possible, as cheaply as possible, with as minimal kind of impact on their part. But the truth of the matter is, it doesn't really matter how fast you do it, because you're going to have to go for an audit, and the queue for an audit is about a year long. So you've got a year. You don't need to do it within 2 weeks. It won't particularly matter. And in fact, if you do not, be slow about it, but if you do it at a sort of moderate pace, you'll actually learn and benefit a lot more from the process than trying to rush through it and just tick a box and say, I'm compliant. So yeah, they go through bargaining. And then there's a sort of short phase I kind of label as depression. So you kind of, once you've realised, okay, it's not going to be cheap or fast, and I have to do it, and I was wrong before, you kind of feel a bit depressed. And again, as consultants, we have to sort of put our hand on their shoulder and say, look, it's okay. We've done this hundreds of times. You're going to make it, but you do need to do X, Y, and Z. And then the final stage is acceptance. And that's such a brilliant feeling when you finally get that a company is accepted fully. And the ones that do the best actually fully embrace the processes that we put in place for quality management and quality assurance. And we had one client who said to us, look, without this kind of deep level of understanding that we now have across our whole team, we wouldn't be passing these customer audits that they're putting on us. We're very proud of the level of documentation and evidence we can show people. It's also fantastic when they're onboarding new people. They have a quality management system and policies and things for new hires to read and go, okay, this is how we do things in this company. This is how we ensure clinical grade performance of our software. This is how we ensure safety. This is how we react to adverse events and things like that. And so it becomes this kind of celebrated thing. And all of the companies that we've helped achieve regulatory clearance have just been so thankful for that kind of, that almost like enlightening journey. And I love seeing people go through it. And what's the best thing about it is the first time you do a regulatory clearance is the hardest. Like the first time you sit a test, it's always the hardest. It gets easier. And so a lot of these software companies want to produce multiple medical devices. They want to produce absolutely this and that and this. And the first one is definitely the hardest. But it gets easier and easier and easier. So it's like teaching someone to fish rather than just giving them a fish. And so we've got one client in Israel. I think they're getting a regulatory clearance about once every 3 months now. And we just go in and we do mock audits to prepare them for their audits. And they've got a quality management system with now, I think, 130 people using it. And they've got, I think 20-something plus algorithms on market, all regulatory cleared. And so I think once you kind of get to that acceptance phase and you go, right, this is how we do it, that's when your business can take off if your product is desirable by the end users. So there's an upside to all this regulatory stuff.
And it doesn't sound like it's because I think or do you think that there's a misconception that regulation is sometimes a bad thing? Because it sounds like it adds a lot of value, and it certainly is almost like the ultimate achievement for a company that's trying to create a medical device. I mean, when someone celebrates that they've got FDA approval, it's a massive milestone. So do you think sometimes there is a misconception that regulation is bad?
Yeah, there's almost like a kind of unspoken conspiracy theory that's going around that the regulations stifle innovation. And I really hate that phrase because regulations do not stifle any innovation. People are innovating every single day, all the time. Academia is coming up with ideas all the time. There's so many publications you can't keep up. Innovation is happening. The regulations do not stop people doing that. What the regulations do is they make sure that any innovation that is going to go to be used on real people in the real world meets certain standards, which if you think about it logically is kind of like, well, that's exactly what I want regulation to do. It doesn't stifle innovation. It slows down very slightly good innovation from getting to market. But that time period is how long it takes to prove that your innovation is safe and effective. Like, you wouldn't want someone to design an aeroplane and then the next day people are getting on that aeroplane. You want that period of testing to show that things are robust and they work. So I really don't like the phrase stifling innovation. I think at its sort of most core sort of process, what regulation is just saying, if you meet a standard, you can do X, Y, Z. You can do whatever you want. But you have to meet that standard. And by saying regulations stifle innovation, you're kind of saying, I don't want to meet those standards. Thanks. Which is kind of an arrogant way to approach the market. I'm such a good software engineer that my software is definitely cyber secure. I don't need someone to do penetration testing. I don't need a cybersecurity certificate. It's like, well, why not?
Yeah. And how is gaining regulatory approval different from actually getting something into, for example, the NHS?
Oh, completely different. So as much as we've talked about regulation, it is the first step of a very long journey. And getting regulatory cleared does not mean that you're going to be able to sell your product either. It's literally allows you to be on market. So it allows you to, open up shop and say, buy my product. That doesn't mean anyone's going to use your product. It certainly doesn't mean that your product is going to be better than other products who are out there as well, because it's a competitive world. So yeah, the journey to actually getting it to market starts with a regulatory clearance, and you must maintain that for the lifetime of the times your device is on market. But yeah, getting into the NHS, I hear people say that the NHS is probably the world's worst customer. Like, it's very difficult to sell into, and they negotiate you down on price as much as possible. It's slow, and And it's not a single sort of route into the whole NHS. There is no single route into the whole NHS. The NHS is a very fragmented, slightly disorganised, chaotic, underfunded institution. We love it. It's fantastically useful. But let's be honest, it's not. Like, if you were going to design a health system from scratch, you would not come up with how the NHS currently is, right? So it's very difficult to navigate. And so that's what we also do, is we help people with market access. It's like navigating, trying to get people through that maze of where to go. The NHS also imposes its own regulatory standards on vendors. So you might have heard of the DTAC, which is the Digital Technology Assessment Criteria. The good news is if you've done a CE mark, if you've got regulatory clearance as a medical device, you've done 99% of what the DTAC requires you to do. So a lot of we don't even advertise that we do DTAC consulting, because we're just like, well, if you're a medical device, you've passed the DTAC essentially already. So you can fill out the same forms. You've got your risk management plans. You've done your clinical safety work. So they ask you the DTAC. They ask you for your cybersecurity. They can ask you to be cyber essentials. They can ask you to get onto a procurement framework, all sorts of things. So there's lots of like forms to fill in and lots of bits and bobs to fill in. And what we often find is that you will get a very excited clinician trying to champion a product into a hospital, but they're not the ones who control the purse strings. And then you do find the person who controls the purse strings, but they're not the one who makes the decisions. And then it goes to board level, and then the board are like, well, we don't know what this device does. And it all gets lost in this quagmire of bureaucracy. So it's about championing people to get the right people in the room at the right time and trying to get things through. Then you have a third-party organisation called NICE, the National Institute for Healthcare Excellence. I think that's the acronym. We'll just call it NICE for now. They have a framework by which they can support companies approach the NHS as well. And they are kind of like Emperor Nero. They can give a thumbs up or thumbs down for a technology. And they'll do health technology assessments, HTAs. And for software devices, they will do abridged, shortened versions of that called early value assessments, EVAs. And they will kind of look at a technology, and they will look at, are you regulatory cleared? What's your clinical evidence? What's your health economic evidence? And they will convene a panel of experts to discuss around the clinical area that your product works in, and then they will make a recommendation of whether that technology should be used in the NHS or not. And they haven't said yes to very many health technologies yet. The processes are maturing and they're getting faster, but I think what it comes down to is that a lot of these technologies haven't quite hit the health economic nail on the head yet. They're good at the regulatory stuff. They're good at filling in all the forms the NHS requires them to. But actually, when it comes down to the monetary side of it, the business model doesn't always look as rosy as they'd hoped, and doesn't quite meet the expectations of what the NHS is prepared to pay for a product.
And this is the thing as well, it's who pays for these AI devices, and also where does it bring value in the business or in the healthcare institution? Because if you employ a device in one area, it may actually positively impact different areas down the line or different departments.
We have that. So in radiology AI, the vast majority of early machine learning products were in computer vision models. So they were applied in radiology. And you're right, they were being sold to radiologists, but the radiologists don't hold the purse string. But also the outcomes from a radiology AI product can actually impact other departments. So if you think about lung cancer screening, for instance, yes, the tool might be purchased by the radiology department, but they don't benefit at all, like monetarily from it. It's the lung cancer department who is maybe seeing, earlier stage cancers, which are obviously cheaper and quicker to treat than late stage cancers because the AI is catching cancer earlier. So the radiology department is then going, well, why do we spend our budget on this stuff when we're actually not benefiting? And so you need to take a more holistic approach to the funding of it, and trying to convince the hospital board and the management that actually, look, the budget needs to be linked across the entire care pathway. That can be quite tricky to do.
Because I guess that's kind of the issue, or a lot of discussion around the NHS at the moment, is this siloed approach to, departments and different areas of the NHS being siloed. And yeah, like you said, taking a more holistic approach.
And the reality is that there are very few silos in medicine. Even like surgery and medicine, which are kind of the two major differences in practice, they're not siloed. They rely entirely on each other at various points. And so it does strike me as odd that we separate them out so much. And now, when the technology is now kind of coming in and sort of bulldozing some old, walls or out of the siloed experience, it feels just like the technology is going to dictate that we're going to change the way that we budget and finance healthcare eventually. Because I think that's the only way that we're going to be able to properly leverage the value of all this technology.
Yeah. So it's a systemic issue as much as, a regulatory issue. What I'd like to talk to you about is what unique challenge does AI specifically bring to regulation? Because you spoke about, digital technology and the different classifications that you have, but AI is a different kind of machine, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
When it comes to regulation. So what unique challenges does that bring?
Yeah. So let's define what we mean by AI first. And I'm going to put it into two main buckets. Mm-hmm. This is obviously not like strictly categorical, but these are the two main buckets. We have what I call the deep learning AI. So these are neural networks that are trained on high quality label data to perform very singular tasks. So again, radiology products, on an X-ray, is there a fractured rib? That's the task. And it's just trained on X-rays and it's just labeled with fractured ribs. And so those models are fairly simple to regulate because they are what's known as deterministic. If you give it the same X-ray, it will always give you the same answer, and you can measure the accuracy over a number of cases and over time. So they're fairly easy to regulate because the performance is fairly easy to measure. And even though we don't fully know how the neural networks are exactly doing what they're doing,
explainability?
It doesn't really matter so much because we know that we know how accurate it is. We know accurately how accurate it is. Then you have this new generation of AI, the generative AI wave, large language models, and now increasingly large vision models and multimodal models. So we're putting all sorts of different data types into much larger neural networks. And we're not giving them singular tasks to do. We're just saying, look, here's everything. It's like chucking like the kitchen sink at a model. Here's everything. And now I'm just going to use you to do anything. Now that's much harder to regulate. How do you regulate a multi-purpose thing that, A, we don't really understand how it's actually doing what it's doing. We kind of know it's predicting words based on sort of tokenization of the data it's seen. And also, it's non-deterministic. So if you give it, if you try this with ChatGPT, if you give it a prompt and press enter, it will give you a response. Open a new chat, give it the same prompt. It won't give you the same response every time. It'll be slightly different. And so how do you regulate something that has variability in its responses? How do you regulate something that it's very hard to nail down what is the use case? Like, where are the boundaries of what you're capable of doing? It's hard to regulate something that it's like a cloud. Like, how do you draw an outline around it? It's very difficult. And how do we train people to use these things safely? Because if you can have infinite inputs and infinite outputs, what do you measure? It's really, really difficult, like, conceptually to think about. So the generative AI wave is causing headaches for both people who want to bring it to market safely, but also for the regulators as well. And in fact, this week, the FDA, who are the regulators in America, are having a public consultation, which I'm looking forward to catching up on after this, about how they're going to regulate generative AI. And we might have to see a whole new raft of regulatory methodology coming out to support this stuff. So
that's very interesting.
And for people listening now, just so you know, it's still a medical device if you intend for the AI to be used for a medical purpose, right? It's still a medical device. And it still needs regulatory approval. But because the regulators don't know how to regulate this stuff, not a single generative AI product has regulatory clearance yet. So you shouldn't be using them as a clinical grade tool to rely on in, say, a hospital right now. And the problem is, going back to the start of our discussion, there are doctors, there are nurses who are still using this stuff
quite a lot
as a medical device in their work, and they don't know they're doing that. And I think that's slightly unfortunate. And I'm hoping that the the royal colleges and the people who are in charge of all the professional bodies start to kind of at least spread the awareness that really, I know ChatGPT is exciting and all these models are exciting, but you shouldn't be using them for your clinical practice, especially if you're using the outputs to help make decisions about your patients. You're in a really ethical, dodgy area with that, potentially breaking patient confidentiality by sending data to these AI systems, and potentially breaching your professional sort of code of conduct by using unapproved technologies in your work. So there are risks and there are dangers. But how dangerous are those risks? We don't know. The simplest things can sometimes go very horribly wrong, but sometimes the most complex things can go horribly wrong as well. And so we just don't know like what the boundaries of the use cases are, what the boundaries of the risks are. So I think it'll be a while before we see a regulatory cleared generative AI system. I'd love to be part of that when it happens, and we're certainly working with some people, talking with the regulators about how they would approach it. So it's an exciting area to be in.
I think that leads on quite nicely as well to how ethics and equity fits into the picture as well. I don't know if you have some thoughts on that.
So ethics, I only think about ethics in the strict academic sense because it's the only way I can get my head around it. Ethics in the academic sense is, do you have the ethical right and the ethical basis to conduct a study? So I always think about ethics from the point of conducting a study. And indeed, you need to go to an ethics board to get ethics approval in order to do any clinical study, including testing AI systems. So that's the kind of way I think about ethics. From that kind of basis of, is this objectively, from an independent group, the right thing to be doing? Have the benefits been argued that they outweigh the risks? Are there plans in place to mitigate against risks? And so that's the kind of approach I take with AI ethics. Other people take other approaches around how AI is interacting with humans and making us feel, and can it emotionally manipulate us, and all the ethics of that. I try and stay away from that, and I try and focus mainly on the ethics of, is it the right thing to do, and what I call permissive ethics. Do we have the permission to do it based on a good moral code of conduct? On equity, that's something the regulators are interested in. So when we talk about equity, we think that a health system should serve all people of all demographics and backgrounds equally well. And sadly, no system does that perfectly. There's postcode lotteries and all sorts of things, and different demographics of the population suffer from different prevalences and incidences of disease, and it's also linked to their financial status, and it can be linked to all sorts of other demographic qualities. What the regulators want you to do is, as a medical device manufacturer, is show that you considered all the end users and be equitable and fair to all your end users. And if you need to exclude a user group, be very clear and transparent about that in your what's known as the instructions for use as well. Don't use this in children, because children aren't just mini adults; they have a very different physiology and things like that. Or this is for use in men over 60, for instance. You have to be very clear about your demographic. AI that's looking at skin cancer might have to be very clear about people's skin tones. And that can be an ethically charged area to go into, but it's the correct thing to do to identify which skin tones the AI works better on. And it's not the AI's fault it doesn't work as well on the different skin tones. It's probably from the training data not being available. People with darker skin tones don't get as many cancers as people with lighter skin tones. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't try and build an AI that works equally well for both. But if we're unable to, if we can't show that it's safe in all skin tones, that shouldn't stop us from marketing it as being useful in some of those skin tones only, because we don't want to disenfranchise the people it can work on. So you've got ethics and equity issues around things like that in AI. But there is no simple answer to any questions around ethics and equity. I think, again, just goes back to those base principles. So is it the morally correct thing to do, and is it objectively and independently assessed to be so?
Thank you very much. And I guess from your perspective then, where do you think at the moment that AI can have the greatest impact in the healthcare system?
I don't know the answer to that question. If I did, I'd be a very rich person. I think it kind of reminds me of the fact that, with this generative AI wave, everyone has given it some massive monetary value in the future. So the markets have priced in that this is worth billions and billions of dollars. But no one knows why it's valued at that. We just think, it must be really useful. And so when you say, what's the best use case in healthcare? I'm like, I don't know. I haven't figured it out. I can tell you, so with the deep learning AI, the best use case is computer vision. So that could be radiology, looking at pathology slides, looking at skin photos. It could be anything to do with images. That deterministic deep learning AI is incredibly good and accurate. But it can't process multimodal data, so it's only kind of used as a single point use case. So those are very useful. With generative AI, I don't know what the best use case is in healthcare. I think what are we going to see first is generative AI being used in the non-clinical aspects of healthcare, so administrative areas. You might have a generative AI system that could help patients find their way to their appointment or make sure that their appointment is at the right time, convenient to them, and things like that. So these don't really impact the clinical decision-making processes. Or in America, they're trying to use it for helping with their coding and their billing practice. Have we made sure that we've billed the patient for all the things we did while they were admitted to hospital? So those don't impact the care. The care's already happened. They're just billing for it afterwards. And I think we're more likely to see generative AI do all of that stuff or start to help with that stuff well before we see it being used as a clinical grade tool.
I'm quite interested to know about your involvement in the Topol review. Because I actually spoke to someone recently who on a panel asked a question, and they said that's one of the reviews that they felt wasn't covered enough in sort of the public media and things like that. So I'm intrigued to know what your involvement was in that and some of the findings from that and where they may be applicable today.
Yeah, so the Topol review was named after Eric Topol, who's an American cardiologist. And he was invited by Jeremy Hunt, who was the health secretary, to come over and have a look at the future of the NHS with various new technologies. So there were arms within the Topol review looking at robotics, and there was an arm that I was involved with looking at AI. And they convened a whole bunch of academics, experts, clinicians, and they made certain people chairs of each arm. So I was a co-chair of the AI aspects of the Topol review, and our job was to conduct loads of stakeholder interviews around the workforce and trying to figure out where is AI going to have the most significant impact and how do we prepare the workforce for what's coming down the stream. I think it took about a year, and then we published a big report, and there was a big launch event and stuff. And the legacy of that has been, I think, primarily what was known as the Topol Fellowships. So clinicians are allowed to apply each year to be in a cohort of what's known as Topol Fellowships, where they learn about proper implementation of AI systems into the NHS. So they might work alongside an industry partner who's bringing an AI solution into a hospital, or they might work on the hospital side as kind of like that sort of project manager to help get that product into the market. And so the Topol review, not only did it sort of forward project what AI could be doing in the future, but it's also helped the NHS prepare its workforce for that. And so you'll meet people who are Topol fellows as a result of that. So yeah, I think it was an interesting experience. It was lovely to be part of sort of the academic and scientific network involved with that. And Eric, I'm still friendly with him from that. He's gone on to do great things back over in America on the basis of it. So yeah, a really, really good project to have been involved with.
What is your best advice for people in jurisdictions where regulation hasn't been modernised for machine learning and artificial intelligence?
Well, that's a good question. Are you talking about low middle income countries mainly, or okay?
Essentially, just regions, I guess, where they don't have that kind of.
So yeah, you're right. So we have three major regulatory jurisdictions which are very advanced, which is the American FDA, the European Medicines Authority, the EMA, and the UK, the MHRA, are probably the three most respected and and replicated regulatory systems in the world. You also have others which are very good. So China's got is a very good regulatory system. Japan, South Korea, Canada, Brazil, Australia. All of these have got very solid regulatory regimes. And what they have done is they've actually formed what's known as the International Medical Device Regulatory Forum. So representatives from all the countries who have a competent authority for medical devices, they're part of this international forum where they actually produce annual guidance on topics. And obviously AI is the topic du jour, and so they produce guidance on that. So the IMDRF, as they're known, are kind of the ones to look to, I'd say. If a country does not have a solid or robust regulatory system, they should be leaning to look at IMDRF guidance. And so a good example is the issue of risk classification. How do we assess how risky a device is? How do we put it into a category? Because the risk will define how much work you have to do to show that your device is safe. So the IMDRF risk classification table is now pretty much used by every regulatory regime around the world. So that's a really, really good place to start. It also means that you don't have to do a lot of work to catch up with more advanced regulatory systems, because you can just apply the current principles that are there. So that would be my advice. The second thing I think I would say to these countries is you have to invest in the resources and the staff to uphold the regulations. Regulations only work if two things are true: that people follow them and the regulators uphold them and have teeth and be able to punish people for not doing the right thing. Because obviously if people aren't following the regulations, then obviously they're not working. But also, if the regulators don't have powers to correct things when they go wrong, then what's the point of having them? So that's the second thing I'd say to countries that don't have regulatory systems, is invest in that workforce and put some power behind them.
And what about entrepreneurs or innovators themselves? I guess look towards that as well.
So entrepreneurs and innovators in countries where there are no regulatory system, you're really going to have to probably do one of two things. Go to America to get an FDA clearance, because most countries without a regulatory system will accept an American clearance because they're very well respected. Or go to Europe and get a CE mark, because the same is true. The CE mark is kind of accepted around the world.
Some organisations are taking a wait-and-see approach to see what their peers or competitors do to adopt AI. And what do you think their risk is of waiting?
I think in some cases it can be quite a sensible approach. Not everyone has to be the kid at the front of the queue for the iPhone when it comes out. You have early adopters, you have sort of slow adopters, and you have late adopters. And I think it's perfectly fine. I mean, I'm not convinced any AI has been yet shown to be so useful that it's almost like a risk not having it. I'm not aware of anything sort of that impactful yet. I mean, as much as developers would like to think all their products are like that, it's not the case, right? So I don't think there's much of a risk of waiting and seeing. I think for some of the big name trusts, Great Ormond Street and things like that, there can be a bit of a reputational risk of not being seen to be involved at the cutting edge. But also, equally, they'll know that if they do a deployment and it goes wrong, that's a bigger reputational risk for them as well. So, yeah, I don't think it's particularly risky for people to wait and see. I think it's more risky to rush in without that critical thinking. Yeah.
I like that you brought up Apple there as well, because that's a classic Apple move. They don't take the first step, but they go behind and generally try and do it better than everyone else.
Yeah, you're right. And in fact, even if you look at generative AI, Apple were one of the last people to kind of incorporate it. And even when they have incorporated it, it's very kind of understated. It's not kind of the main selling point, I think. So yeah, watching and waiting can pay off, especially if you want to do things properly, which I think people want to do in healthcare.
Unless they want to make a lot of money really quickly.
Oh, no one makes a lot of money. No one makes lots of money really quickly in healthcare. No. You can lose a lot of money really quickly.
Yeah. There are so many standards on aspects of AI. So how do organizations shift through which ones they need to apply and which ones they don't?
Yeah, I mean, this is where the driving instructor analogy comes in. Is you need someone to help show you the ropes and which ones are important and which ones aren't. But even more than that is which bits of which standards are the tricky bits, which are the bits that are going to trip you up or give you the most headache. So in essence, I like to think of like 3 kind of levels of standard. You have the base standards, which everyone's going to have to use regardless of what they're doing. So these are standards around cybersecurity, around usability, around quality management. These things are going to apply to whatever the type of technology is that you're building. And then you've got sort of the cutting edge standards, so standards which are relatively new, 6 months to a year old, on AI risk management specifically, and AI quality management. And then you have sort of the future standards. So there is a lot of work going on with the standards organizations around the world to update standards, especially for AI. And so good manufacturers of AI medical devices who understand the need for quality assurance and regulation should be keeping an eye out on the draft standards that are being currently consulted on. Or indeed, they can even apply to join the panels and be a member of the group who are developing these standards and have their say in the future of how this sector goes forward. So that would be my advice, is consider standards in different tiers, understand which ones are absolutely fundamental and necessary, understand which ones are applicable to your subtype of device, so the AI standards, and keep an eye out on the future horizons of what's coming down the road.
Brilliant. And personally, what are you most excited or passionate about moving forward in, I guess, the very short term, but also looking ahead 5 years, which in terms of AI, that's, as we've seen, there's a lot that can happen in that kind of time. But yeah, what are you most excited about, I guess?
I'd love to see a generative all-purpose medical AI get to clinical grade, with a regulatory certification. I think we're probably a decade away from that happening, but it'd be so phenomenal to be able to, I think, especially from the consumer point of view, not just have to sort of Google symptoms, but actually have a machine that you can chat to that is, demonstrably very good at being empathetic. If we can prove that it's secure and safe and gives reasonable medical advice, it won't be allowed to make a final diagnosis or prescribe anything, but at least it can give reassurance and advice. I think that'd be a really phenomenally useful tool, which would free up primary care like worldwide. So I think that's what I would be most excited about. I don't know who's working on that, but if you are, let me know.
Yeah, because I think that's a good one. Obviously, very, very big one, but that's one of the key challenges in healthcare, not just here, but globally. It's like supply of doctors and people to actually do stuff. And when we spoke to Keith a few weeks ago, he said, digital transformation in some way he believes it's like necessary for healthcare to come out of the kind of rut that it's in. Like you need some sort of technology to, because there won't be enough people.
Exactly.
You can't have enough people.
Yeah, and technology is the only thing that can scale at that level. So yeah, I'd be very interested in that. I've no idea how realistic that is or how achievable it is from a regulatory point of view, but you've got to try. We made it to the moon, so we can do things if we put our minds to them.
Absolutely.
When we say we made it to the moon, I have never been to the moon.
We went together.
Some clever people did a few years ago.
They did.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. It's been enjoyable.
Yeah, and we'll hopefully catch up soon.
Great.